Hello.
Hello.
I'm gonna record this so I can put it on YouTube for people who can't make this slot.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. We'll give them a couple more minutes. Otherwise, we'll just jump in. You guys can ask your questions.
Sounds good to me.
You guys got the email, right, with the questions?
Yeah. Been looking at the past couple days.
Good.
How have you been doing with teaching online?
I've been busy.
I bet, yeah.
Crazy busy, actually. And I don't know. I think this was the hardest class, I think, in how to think about how to organize it, because I am teaching a 500 level class, and we just sit around and discuss the book. So it's a small class, and Zooming is not much different than sitting around a table.
Yeah.
So that one's not bad. And then the 132, it's just straight lecture. So I'm recording the lecture, so I don't think it goes as well as being in the classroom, but it's not dramatically different in terms of delivery. But this one, I don't usually set out notes and do sort of a straight lecture. It's supposed to be more of a discussion. And so this one's one I think has probably been distorted the most.
Yeah, but a third person.
We've increased by 33 1/3. Well, since we're recording, I guess we can get started, and stragglers come in, they can catch up with what they missed. So what am I going to do that's a little different? So I'll do the drawing the same. We're slotted for what, 11 to 12:50, right? 11 to 12:50 on Monday. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll do the drawing on Zoom, and then I'll send an email around with the questions that are drawn at 11 o'clock. And then you guys, we'll answer whatever those 4 questions are. And then you guys will type them up, and then I will have you submit them to a safe assignment account on Blackboard. And I'll give you until 6 o'clock. So you have more time in case there's some sort of technological screw up. But these would be the same 10 questions I would give you if we were doing it in class. So my expectations for the answers are going to be the same as if we were doing it in class, right? So what's a little different is, you're going to, instead of writing them in a blue book and handing them in and being done, you're going to have to, type them onto a Word document and then submit them to safe assignment. But in terms of testing, I don't think it really changes much. You won't have to make a note card because you're going to be sitting at your little desks as you are now. So aside from that, I mean, it's the same structure. You got the 10 questions, I'll draw 4, and that'll be it. So do you have any questions about the mechanics?
What day did you say that was going to be on?
It's the same slot that we were slotted by the university. Monday from 11 to 12:50 is the official time for the exam. If you have an exam in that afternoon and you need more time, just let me know, and I'll figure out, if you need more time when you're done to submit it, I can be flexible in terms of that. But, I'm anticipating the exam will run from no more than 11 to 12:50, but if you stretch out a little bit longer, that's fine. I want to leave the time to submit the exam a little later, just so that, there's always some technological screw up somewhere along.
Yeah.
So that way we don't have to worry about, I tried to download it and it wouldn't fit or whatever, So, I'll build a little safe assignment slot for the exam questions and just answer all your questions on a Word document and submit that, and then you'll be done.
Okay, cool.
If you finish at 12:50 and want to hand it in at 12:50, hand it in at 12:50. You don't have to wait till 6. I'm just building it out to 6 in case there's some catastrophe
Gotcha.
or some other catastrophe. Any other mechanics questions? All right. Why don't you hit me with whatever questions you have about the questions? I have the answer sheet right here.
Okay, so on question, I'm just making sure I have the right one. On question number 9, I understand how they are different, but I'm struggling with how they are similar, how their visions are similar.
Okay. You want to take a crack at it?
I was afraid you're going to ask that. I literally just have my answer written out for how they are different. So I'm really struggling on that one.
You have your answer right now, how they're the same or how they're different? You're struggling with different?
How they're different.
You're struggling with how they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So they arrive at a similar point from different directions, right? So Elliot thinks about things growing out to sort of a global thing. And Benton starts at the global and sees how they link together, but also how they develop a little differently, right? So she's comparing, in this case, the Atlantic world with the Indian Ocean world, but they're part of a larger structure as she sees it. But they both end up at the same spot. The Atlantic world is part of a larger system. So thinking about how they're the same would revolve around how they reach similar type of conclusions about organizing.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess I could have guessed that, but I didn't know if there was more to it or, but okay.
That one's pretty simple.
Yeah, I like to overthink.
Yeah, so that's sort of the difficulty with having all this extra time, right? Because then you're like, maybe I should think about this more. No, stay right where we are. You know, what I would say is that you may or may not have noticed, you guys probably noticed, but I'm not sure everybody did, that these questions are a little bit more narrowly drawn than the midterm. That is kind of by design. They're a little bit more narrow than the midterm. The midterm questions are a little bit more expansive. And that's really a function of when I structure this final exam, even though you have an hour and 50 minutes, I figure you probably have about 20 to 25 minutes to answer each question. An hour and 15 minutes to answer 2 midterm questions, because I do it during class time, is that gives you a little bit more than half an hour to answer both, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because this is pitched at what would be a shorter period of time, the questions are a little bit more narrowly drawn. So if you're thinking, boy, that doesn't seem like there's a lot for me to talk about in terms of that, you know, as this component of the question, don't overthink it. That's because of the way the exam questions are structured.
Good to know. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a wonderful segue into my first question, because I feel like number 1 isn't so much like that, because it's very broad. It's like, how did the Atlantic slave trade evolve as a business? And it's like, I'm really struggling with how to answer that question, because it's like such a big one.
Okay. I'm thinking about it narrowly. So why don't you tell me when you think about it as a big question?
I was just thinking of it like sort of like it was from a point A to point B, but I couldn't really find anything that seemed like that's what it was talking about in the lectures. And I think that might have been one that we talked about in class, and I just didn't take very good notes. So I'm kind of struggling with how to answer it, because the only way I can think to answer it would be like just to explain what happened, but I don't think that's what the question is asking. At least that's not my impression.
No, this one is kind of pitched narrowly at sort of the business components of it, which is why I tried to limit it by saying viewed from the European perspective. Okay. So what are the mechanisms that the Europeans developed, or that developed as the Europeans ran this business, to run the slave trade as a business? right? So rather than thinking about the whole broad growth of the Atlantic world slave trade, right, which could be one way to think about that question, which I think is what you're thinking about. I'm
Yeah.
thinking more about the tools that are developed by Europeans to actually finance this business, right? So it's, you know, having some notion about what kind of business this is, right? So it's a long distance trade business. It's very expensive, enormously expensive. I mean, that's one of the things that Klein's examination and others, Klein and others do. What they do is they shatter some of the old myths, right? So the old myth was that, you know, Europeans brought some trinkets, snatched slaves off the coast, and made a ton of money. Well, what Klein shows is that they weren't bringing trinkets and they weren't snatching people off the coast. They developed very complex business tools and implements in order to do that, right? So some brief discussion about how this is an expensive, complicated business, and then the funding tools they develop, right? How does one fund it?
Cool. All right. I think that gives me enough to
Well,
look.
let's work our way through it. How does one fund it? What do you do?
Oh, I didn't realize that was a question.
You thought it was hypothetical. No, that was a concrete question.
Oh gosh, I need to dig in my memory. That was a while ago.
If you were to undertake an expensive operation today, what would be some of the mechanisms you'd do to raise the money to do it?
Take out a loan, maybe.
Okay. So you take out a loan. Who's got that kind of money to lend to you?
Well, rich people do, but banks as well would be the big one.
An expensive operation, right? Very expensive operation. You may have a few deep-pocketed individuals who can do that, right? They're going to put their funding in. What's the problem with that?
Aside from the fact that their interest would be primary because they're the one funding it.
Right? Is this a sure thing? What happens?
Not sure what you're getting at.
What can happen on a slave voyage?
Oh, on a slave voyage, rebellion, that was the thing, right?
Rebellion could happen.
Death, sickness.
Right? The ships could sink. Pirates could steal them. All kinds of bad things can happen in which, if you're the primary investor, you lose all your capital. So finding deep-pocketed individuals to fund these things. So we're talking about deep-pocketed individuals. Who else has a pile of money that can invest in that?
Well, earlier I said banks. Was that one of them?
Well, banks rely upon deep-pocketed individuals to put money there.
Oh, that's true. Okay.
Who else would have the kind of resources to do that? Who were the first, what was the first system that was involved in this?
Not sure what you mean by that.
Who were the first, what was the first kingdom, empire, state engaged in this?
Oh, the Spanish.
They were not the first, right? They weren't the first. That's why Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas.
Oh, the Native Americans then? Is that what you're talking about?
Not in the Atlantic slave trade.
That's why I was confused. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but.
Who developed and protected their interests in sailing down the coast of Africa?
Was that the Portuguese?
Portuguese, right?
Yeah. So
and what kind of business were they? Privateers? Were they private investors? How did they get the wherewithal and the scratch to sail down the African coast? Who were they sailing for?
It wouldn't just be the Portuguese crown, would it be?
Right, the Portuguese state. So this is a
Simple
state
answer.
business, right?
Yeah.
Remember I talked about Henry the Navigator, right? So when a captain who was Portuguese sailed down the coast of Africa, one of the things they brought with them were expert cartographers who mapped where they were going, right? And when they turned around and sailed back to Portugal, they brought back with them all that information, specifically the mapping, that the next captain who sailed out had with him a cartographer who picked up from where they finished, right? In that way, because it's a state business, that information, knowledge, contacts become state property. The state is the one who has the wherewithal to invest in these type of things first, right? So initially, this is a state business, the Atlantic slave trade. The Portuguese sailing down the coast of Africa, trying to find gold, but taking slaves when they couldn't get gold, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're doing this business as part of the state. The problem with this business of a state is even a state has all sorts of things they're doing, right? And so the state is not primarily engaged in the slave trade. They do have some of that. Other people try to get in. So if you're a deep-pocketed individual, you have that kind of scratch, right? But it's risky. So what would you do? Instead of putting all your money into one slave voyage, what would you do?
I mean, would you put them just into a whole bunch of them?
Okay.
Is that what-
And how would you do that?
Not sure on that one.
Okay. When you buy something outright, you own all of it, right?
Yeah.
What is it when you only buy a part of it?
Oh, when you buy shares, is that
You
what you
buy
mean?
shares in it, right?
Okay, gotcha.
So you could have limited partnerships where somebody with the scratch puts up the financing to outfit, a chunk of the boat, and then somebody else who has the experience. I use the example of how people open restaurants, right? Some people have the money and they open a restaurant, but they don't have the experience, right? And many of those restaurants fail. And then you have people who have the experience, but they get the experience because they work in restaurants. If they had money, they wouldn't work in restaurants, so they don't have the capital. So to put them together, you have somebody with the scratch and somebody with the experience, and you put together a partnership, right? And so then you have both aspects. Well, in a slave voyage, you have somebody who has the money to invest in a slave voyage, and then you have the captains who get a chunk of it, right? So you could have joint partnerships. This is a way of spreading your risk around, right? So instead of putting all your eggs in one basket that could be stolen by pirates or sink in a storm, or the cargo could overthrow and sail away, right? A risky business, you put part of the money in one voyage, and then you put part in another and part in another. And in that way, you begin to bring in partnerships, right? As this business expands, more complex financial instruments are created, right? So Brandy wants to invest in a slave voyage, but she doesn't have a lot of money. So what can you buy? A smaller share.
Part of it.
Right. You buy part of it as a mechanism of investing in this. And so you can get deep-pocketed investors who own a bunch of shares, or you could have somebody who has only a small amount of money to invest, and they get a couple shares. All those things require complex bookkeeping, because whether or not Brandy's 10 pounds she put into this investment is as consequential as the £1 million that somebody else put in. Well, that's a little too dramatic, right? But it's important to Brandy as an investor, and all investors want to ensure that the books are fair and adequate, right? So this leads to complex mechanisms. What would the Crown of Portugal want if they were engaged in this slave trade business?
I would think they would want it to be the most profitable it can be.
Okay, so they want it to be profitable. How can you maximize your profits?
Make sure they're as successful as possible.
Okay, how do you make sure that you're successful in this operation? Maybe we should go back to maximize your profits. At a simple level, how did John Rockefeller get so rich?
Oh God, I have no idea.
Monopoly.
A monopoly, right? What does
Oh,
that
okay,
mean?
yeah, yeah. Oh, is this like the thing with the British where they enforced the monopoly?
Okay. Everybody wants to enforce a monopoly, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
Right? In the case of the slave trade, why is a monopoly not as successful?
Would it be because whoever is controlling most of it would also be footing all the cost and the risk?
So what cost would be involved?
Gosh, however much the slaves cost, however much the ships cost, the
Well, those are going to be high costs for anybody.
yeah, right.
What's the difficulty in what causes the monopolies to fail?
Well, they just get too big, I would think, but
Well,
kind of
big
collapse over
monopoly
time.
just would sound like it'd be more profitable.
I remember in the case of the slave trade, because so many of the ships were just lost or slaves rebelled and took over the ship, you just sometimes lose the ships.
You sometimes lose the ships, but overall, on balance, the slave trade paid very well for the people who own the ships, right? So
Yeah.
you may have short-term losses in some aspects, but if you are the only group doing it, then the profits are better than the losses. So it'll continue as a monopolistic operation to be profitable.
Okay.
What undercuts a monopoly?
Not sure.
Competition.
Okay. Competition from who in the case of the slave trade?
The English and maybe the Spanish.
Other people, other states, and also deep-pocketed individuals or in a consortium of people, they're competing. How do you enforce a monopoly?
Troops.
Okay. Troops, ships, forts, right? All those things are costs that have to be invested in to protect your business, right? So you build a fort on the coast of Africa where you sail ships out to prevent other nations from engaging in the slave trade, right? Those are costs. You have to build the fort. You have to feed, equip, and pay the people who man the fort. You have to dedicate ships just to protect your slave trade. All those things require more money put into it that somebody who doesn't put those amount of monies in can pay more per slave, right? So on one component, on the European side, this profitability of this business encourages all kinds of operators to get in there that undercut your monopoly. So the English try and install a monopoly, but they're completely undercut by French, Spanish, even some English folks flying, not working for the Royal African Company. Everybody is trying to get in on this trade because it's highly lucrative, right? Those fixed costs that state or quasi-state entities try to create make it more expensive to engage in the slave trade, so they have less capital to pay for slaves, right? So if you're not paying all those fixed costs, you can offer more money per head. That's the European side. What's the flip side, the supplier side? Do Africans, that's a question that relates to question 2. Do Africans want a monopoly?
No.
Why not?
Oh, because then they can't control the trade as much. They can't get the stuff that they were wanting from the Europeans.
Okay. Who's going to pay them more?
I would think that they would be able to get more money if everybody's in on it.
Anybody's going to pay them more, right?
Okay, yeah.
So one of the flip side of monopoly, right? So if you have a monopoly and you're the only ones that are buying African slaves, well, then you can say, I don't want to pay that much. Here's what I'm offering. And if there's nowhere else to sell to, well, then the seller is going to have to sell to you, right? If you're the only game in town buying and you're paying 100 pounds a head for a slave, then you'll take your 100 pounds, right? But if the Royal African Company or the Portuguese or the Swedes or whoever's trying to establish a monopoly says, I am only paying 100 pounds a head for a slave, and some French traders show up and say, I'll give you 110, well, you're going to sell to the guy selling for 110 because you make more money doing that, right? In simple terms. The monopoly is undercut on both sides. It's undercut by the buyer side because they can't keep, the Portuguese can't keep everybody out forever. The English, when they try and establish a monopoly, they can't keep everybody out. Those fixed costs that you have to invest in order to keep your monopolistic control means that it's more expensive for you to engage in the slave trade. So somebody who has lower costs can offer more money, so that it's undercut on that side. But it's also undercut on the supply side because Africans trading slaves to these Europeans are trying to maximize their return. So they're undercutting monopoly because it's not in their interest either. If there's people competing to buy their slaves, they can charge more. These are shrewd businessmen who are on the other side of the equation too. We have a lot more data about the Europeans because people like Brandy want to make sure their $10 investment or 10-pound investment is paid off accurately, right? So you have to have these complex ledger books of these operations. It's an enormously complex business, right? Because you're acquiring materials to buy slaves in Europe. You're coming to Africa to purchase these slaves in which you're bartering. You're taking them across the Atlantic Ocean and selling them to the Caribbean or to North America or Brazil or whatever. And then they're paying out over the next 3, 4, 7 years, right? So it takes on average somewhere around 7 years to close the books on a slave voyage. That's enormously complex across very long distances. And so there's this enormous body of paper that's produced that allows historians to reconstruct it, historians like Klein, right? We don't have that on the African side. They're not shipping folks across the ocean. They're not, selling shares in this investment. They're people who are running complex operations on their end, and they're shrewd businessmen, but they don't have these elaborate paper trails that the Europeans do. And if they did, they're not stored in dry, dusty archives like they are in Europe, right? They disintegrate if there's any record keeping after a certain period of time, right? So that monopoly is undercut on both sides, but it's a very complex operation. So the second question deals with the supply side. So one aspect is that Africans control the supply side to maximize their profits, right? What other type of things do we know that tell us about how we know Africans ran the supply side?
I remember that Europeans had a hard time surviving in Africa because of the diseases that they weren't used to.
Yeah, so they couldn't go up the Gambia River and set up a place closer to where the slaves are being acquired, right? They're dependent upon purchasing them on the coast, right? What do they purchase them with?
They were using mostly textiles, but also trading other things.
Okay. Textiles from where?
Was it like India,
Okay.
East Asia?
Right.
I think. Was that right?
Yep.
Gotcha.
So, the old mythology is that they were trading trinkets. They're not. They're acquiring what they called calicos from India, which is fine woven cotton cloth and dyed in patterns that were suited for the market, right? They're not delivering English wool to buy slaves. They have to acquire stuff that the suppliers want. The suppliers are tapped into the Indian Ocean trading system. They have a steady stream of fine calicos. They want more, right? So that's what Europeans have to purchase it with. They want, there's handicraft or manufactured goods like muskets and things like that. They purchased slaves with French brandy or English rum or something, right? So there's some things that Europeans manufacture. They also, in some places, demand cowrie shells. Cowrie shells are used as a type of currency. They have no value in London. You can't go to the pub and buy a pint with your cowrie shells, but in certain regions of Africa, they're used as a currency, and that's what they demand. They want cowrie shells in lieu of other things, right? They want Swedish bar iron, right? Not finished iron products. They say, just give us the raw material, we'll make it into the stuff we want. So all these things are terms dictated by the suppliers, right? We know that the price fluctuates. When a slave voyage that's coasting, right, when they're sailing up and down the coast trying to fill their hold with slaves, we know that the prices they pay later in their coasting operation are higher than at the beginning, right? That's sort of that complex arrangement of paperwork. So we know that if they're more expensive, then the suppliers know that you got to fill the ship, so you're willing to pay more because you're getting close to sailing. All these things tell us about the supply side of the equation. So I purposely split that question, pitching it a more narrow approach to say, I want to know about the business instruments that are created on the European side. And then I want to talk about the supply side as businessmen, right? Because that's what Klein's approach is. And say, how do we know the Africans controlled the supply side? Klein gives us lots of evidence. Okay, so that's 1 and 2. Clarify those two? All right.
Yeah, I think so.
What else you got?
With number 5, I think it is, it's talking about why social order and political order are related to British governing authority. I remember the better sorts and lower sorts, and then their middling sorts kind of came out, but I was a little unclear on, I guess, the details on exactly how that ties in outside of just a class dynamic.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a run at?
Sounds like a no.
Okay, so it's a class dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Who runs government in Britain?
The nobles, the better sorts.
The better sorts, right?
Yeah.
How do we know they're the better sorts?
Can you say that? Sorry, I missed that.
How do we know they are the better sorts?
I kind of get the impression it's just because that's where they were, so they called them that.
When you mean that's where they were, what do you mean that's where they were?
Like they were, because they were the upper class, they were called that.
Okay. How does one become upper class?
I got the impression it was familial, at least in part. You were just kind of born in that.
Okay,
system.
you're born into it.
Yeah.
The lower sorts, the meaner sorts, are born into their role. They don't rise and become the better sorts, right? You're born into your role, that's who you are. That rise in economic terms is why the middling sorts it's created, right? There are people who are, they develop the means, usually through trade, right? They're merchants. The merchant class begins to acquire some money, but they're not born into the upper class. They're not born as the better sorts, right? So you're right that at its root, it has this class-based formation. What signifies, in addition to who you're born to, right? What signifies you're the better sort?
Don't quite remember that one. Aside from the fact that I guess you have money. Go ahead.
That's right. They flaunt their resources, like they show, like with the tea, do you want two, like 1 lump or 2? They just kind of flaunt that they have all of these, like their finances, and they have the proper behavior.
Good. What is the proper behavior? So let's talk about tea. What does that mean to be the proper behavior for tea?
To ask, like, do you want tea? And then just because that's like a luxury good, and to show that you have that means like you're better. And then sugar is also a luxury good, so to even ask that, do you want 1 lump of sugar or 2, is just saying like, I have enough and I can just share it with everyone, just kind of show off.
And not share in a socialist way, like I have a bunch of sugar, we should all get a little bit of sugar. It's designed to reinforce your superior status, and it's done in a particularly display of politeness, right? So it's part of a ritual. You invite someone to tea, and you sit and you're giving them tea, which is an expensive imported luxury good, and then you're offering them unlimited amounts of sugar to sweeten their tea to demonstrate your position. But it's done in a particularly formalized way because, as you said, those are manners, the proper manners. So the people who are of the ruling class have very staged mannered things they have to do, because that's displaying your sophistication and your superior status. In order to be someone who runs or has governing authority, political power, right, you have to be a gentleman, right? And how do you manifest that? Not by mucking in the fields, right? By sitting and having high tea, or, you know, wearing the proper clothes or carrying the proper walking stick. Certain markers of your elevated status are designed to reinforce your political role. If you're a rich person who eats with both hands and guzzles, cheap beer, you're not suited to role or to rule. You don't fit the role, because part of it is your public presentation as a gentleman is tied together with social mores and customs that demonstrate your fitness for that position, right? So gentility is part of it. So we talked about tea. How does this play out? So that's that sort of class-based, you're born into these roles. One of the things you learn as being a member of the upper class is how to use the proper silverware, right? How to engage in proper gentleman and lady-like behavior, though ladies don't have political power unless they're the queen, right? There's no lady sheriffs, because their gender roles are strictly adhered to as well. But in order to have rule, you have to be of the right sorts. You have to be a better sort. And there's all sorts of markers that demonstrate that, right? So that's how it is in Britain. How is it the same and how is it different in the American colonies?
Under the American colony, because of all the trade and the distance from Britain, the middling sorts kind of arose out of that, where they were able to actually get a decent amount of wealth
Mhm.
and go up from being a lower sort to somebody with a little bit more money,
Right?
but not necessarily all the way up to a noble.
Being rich is not enough. When you become rich, what do you have to do?
You have to use it, like show all those manners and those
Okay.
social norms, culture.
We
Of
have,
the middle
we
class
have the
to show that
example
you're
of King Carter in Virginia, right? So he started as an indentured servant, but he became wealthy because he had survived his indenturitude and then got his own tobacco property and began to grow and make a fortune. And when he became rich, he had a nice, expensive house, right? That's two. But then he would display those sort of over-the-top customs of politeness. He'd invite people to have lunch with him from the countryside, but then they'd be met with this bewildering array of silverware that has to be used in a certain order. This is designed to put his people, his guests, ill at ease because they don't know all these customs. And it reinforces, well, then he must be one of the better sorts because he knows how to use a salad fork, right? So these type of things are the displays of superiority that are designed to reinforce, right? So I use the example, the Stamp Act, which which is part of question 10. It's particularly telling and perfect in the British mindset about how they're going to enforce the Stamp Act. Parliament says, you know, you're going to have to enforce the collection of these stamps, but they're not going to send somebody from Parliament to each little town to do this. What they do is they try and co-opt the better sorts in town to get on board with this program. And how do they do it? They say, we're going to give you a little taste of it, right? You're going to sell these stamps. You're going to send, I don't know, 90% of the money back to the crown. But for all the stamps you sell, you get 10% for yourself, right? So the idea is co-opting the better sorts in town into this program so they make a little money on it so it's worth their while. That's the design to ensure compliance from everybody else. Because if the better sorts set the path, the lesser and middling sorts will follow along. That's the British mindset. Along those lines as well is that there's a proper way of doing things which is very orderly, right? So your proper behavior as a gentleman is about ensuring your rule, but also the way you run things. So if you have a disorderly looking farm, that's a sign that you're not a better sort who's well organized and suited for rule, right? That's always one of the knocks that British, upper class British travelers had, was they'd comment on the farms, right? That look disorderly. They, you know, especially in Virginia where they have so much land and not enough labor that they use all these techniques to exploit the property, but don't require the same huge inputs of labor, right? So instead of cutting down a forest and then planting neat rows of tobacco, they girdle a tree so it drops its leaves, and then they plant the tobacco underneath. And then as the tobacco exhausts the soil, they burn the trees down, right? The dead trees down, and then that recharges the soil for another period of time. And then when the soil is exhausted because you're growing a monocrop, you move to a new patch of forest, right? That way, you make use of the property in a very efficient manner because you're not doing the backbreaking work of clearing the trees and digging out the stumps and all the roots and then planting tobacco rows, right? Because there's an enormous amount of property and not an enormous amount of labor. But to the British eyes, who have been farming the same plot of land for 1,000 years, it looks disorderly, which is a sign that these people are not suited to rule. They can't even control the landscape and farmland. How can they possibly have their own political say, right? They're always going to come up short in the eyes of the British, partly because of things like that, and also almost everybody who populated the New World were the lower and middling classes. Very few aristocrats came over to carve out the American colony, right? They're mostly the lower sorts, and so they're never going to have the proper breeding in the eyes of this ruling class. We've had this conversation around my household. You know, in the impeachment trial, there were two high officials who were called to testify in one fashion or another, who were British, and both of them, you know, have reached very high status in academia and the political world. And both of them said they had to leave the UK because their accents marked them as somebody who wouldn't reach the highest strata. Because they had what were considered lower class British accents, they didn't have the Cambridge accent, their opportunities would be blocked. I was just amazed that that is still sort of the mindset, that people would leave the UK and pursue their opportunities in the United States, where they become very highly accomplished individuals. They said they had to leave the UK because of their accent. That's an echo of this sort of the better sorts ruling order that still apparently has some measure of sway, at least in the perception of opportunity in the UK. That's crazy to me. What other questions? It's your time. Think of all the people not here who may watch it on YouTube.
I guess I can ask about number 6. I'm pretty sure I've got that one down. But so why were the British less successful than the Spanish and the French in exporting their religion? The stuff that I found that I remembered as well was that they had a tendency to expect their religion to be superior, and that would be the thing that convinced Native Americans.
Right.
And when that didn't happen, they didn't really go another way, and also that they had religious conflict at home as well, so that came across in a different way.
So when you say religious conflict at home, what do you mean?
Huh?
When you say religious conflict at home, what do you mean?
Well, just that there was maybe it's more that there's a lot of religious difference and religious arguments between like the Scottish, the Irish, particularly, and also how when English settlers came, like they were fleeing religious persecution. Is generally how it said, or they wanted to practice it differently at the least.
Can you give some names and examples?
Not off the top of my head. I'm sure I could dig for it, but you know,
not individual names, like religious approaches.
Oh, okay, like the Quakers, the Puritans. They're Irish Catholics,
right?
And of course Protestantism in general. I'm trying to think of
Presbyterians from Scotland.
Yeah.
Church of England is Anglican.
Yeah.
Right. You later have dissenters like The Amish and the Mennonites, they're a little bit later. They're not English. But you have a variety of different religious traditions coming from the British Isles, right? This one specifically asks and mentions both the French and Spanish. So I would anticipate that you would talk about the French approach briefly and the Spanish approach briefly, right? When the Spaniards come across, how many different religious sects do they represent?
Pretty much just one, right? There's
Right.
Spanish Catholics.
Spanish Catholics. And when the French come across primarily, what are they coming as?
They also be coming as Catholic, or they be
Also
Protestant?
coming as Catholics, right? So both the French and the Spanish have very much a missionary component as part of their efforts, right? The British do not. When the Puritans come, the Puritans are coming to establish a Puritan or pure colony. It's not to say, let's convince the native people of the glories of Puritanism, right? They're coming to establish a pure colony for other Puritans, as they envision it. That, of course, is not really true. Even on the Mayflower, only a slight majority of people who came across were Puritans. There were lots of other people who came along, but at least in the way they established a colony, it was to be a Puritan, all right, a purified, pure colony. Pennsylvania was established by Quakers. Maryland was established by Catholics, right? At least ostensibly, but none of these places were exclusive to those. And very few of the British traditions are missionary in intent, right? There is something that's the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel that the British established, so maybe talk a little bit about how successful it was and what limitations it labored under, right? That would be probably contributing to that answer. So the Spanish, how do they come? What is their structure? What do they establish?
Don't they I could be wrong on this, but don't they make churches that they would make places there, and they would allow it to blend in with the local religion? Is that accurate?
Catholicism as a missionary religion is, as is true of many missionary religions, have a syncretic feature, right? So, the establishment of Catholicism in Mexico incorporates traditional Mexican traditions, right? So you have the Day of the Dead, which is a ceremony for your ancestors, which is celebrated on All Souls Day, November 1st, right? So they try and blend things together to facilitate this sort of incorporation of other folks. That's part of a missionary religion, right? Is that intent, the syncretism that's inherent upon it. But the Spanish, when they initially set it up, they established what are called missions, right? So that's why it's San Francisco and San Antonio. The core of these places are the mission, which is the establishment of the Spanish church with the intent of converting the people to Catholicism in the mission. So they bring them to the mission, right? The mission system is a key component of what's the Reconquista, right? Which is on the Iberian Peninsula, which the Spanish bring to the New World, is the sword and the cross. In one hand, they're the sword of conquest. In the other hand, it's the cross of conversion, right? In the Iberian Peninsula, it's converting the Moors and Jews to Catholicism, right? In the New World, it's converting the native peoples, the Mayans, the Incas, the various sundry sets of native people they encounter. It's to convert them, and the mechanism they use is the mission, right? What do the French do?
Don't really remember that one.
Do they use like a missionary outreach?
Right.
I have a note about black robes, but I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure what it means. I just wrote black robes.
It's a great film, by the way.
Okay.
It's about the Jesuits. And what the Jesuits, the French missionary system is, they send representatives, oftentimes Jesuits, not always, and they go and live amongst the native peoples. And they live with them, and they study their culture and their religious practices, and then they try and convert them to Catholicism. So the Jesuits go and live with, let's say, the Hurons, right? So the Jesuits live with the Hurons. They learn to speak the language. They learn how the people live. They live right with them. And then they busily try and convert them to Catholicism, right? The missionary component, it's not the key driver for French settlement, but it is it's an aspect of it. And their method, instead of bringing all the people to the mission like the Spanish do, the French send emissaries out, always with the intent of conversion. It's not just jeepers, let's learn about the culture, right? They do that. The Jesuit records amongst native peoples in New France. It's a wonderful historical resource because they have to report back. So they write these very detailed letters and reports that have been stored. So that's how we know as much as we know, or at least it contributes to our knowledge about the native peoples of Canada and the upper regions of North America, because the French Jesuits were trying to convert them, and in doing so, they learned all these things about them and they reported back, right? Those are two different missionary approaches, but they're key components of that. When you measure the SPG against the British and the French effort, the Spanish and the French efforts, it's so paltry because it's not a key component of what they're trying to do. The English colonies are not set up to convert the natives, right? There's a lot of things that go into it, as we've discussed, but part of it is just, it's not their intent, where it was part of the original intent of both colonization movements by the Spanish and the French. Always primaries to get rich. But I suppose they seek to justify the Crown's investment by talking about how they're going to convert all these people too. What else? What other questions? All right. If you have no other questions, I'll stop it here and then I'll post it. If you guys think up some more questions, shoot me an email. Anything that you're unclear about, just let me know, and I'll make that clear. All right. So look, Monday around 11ish. I'll send a Zoom around so you can see that I'm actually flipping those cards over. I know how suspicious you all are. And then you'll have until 6 o'clock to turn it in. All right. And Claire and Brandy, I know I got your paper. Lisa, did you send me a paper yet?
Yeah, this morning.
Okay. All right. So I'll get working on that, and then I should have all those grades entered before you get to the final. So I'm working on your guys' stack right now. Well, not right.
Thanks.
All right. So I'll see you Monday. If you have any questions, just let me know. Stay healthy.